Hi, Write Writers. Thank you so much for joining me. Cruz here. Today, we're going to be looking at, in this video, two sample essays. Both essays scored a 7, and these are students who are definitely taking ENC 1101, and we're going to look at what they did well and how to ensure that you incorporate some of their writing strategies so that you too can level up your essay writing and make sure that you also get into ENC 1101. So let's go ahead and get started, Write Writers. Here we go. Sample essay number 1. We'll start with our cold reading first. The decisions we make on a daily basis shape the type of person we are, along with the type of person others see us as. When a child is young, they are guided and do not have much of a say in decision making. However, as an individual gets older, they are expected to start making their own decisions. Decision making can be complex for some individuals, while on the other hand, for some, deciding what they want is something that comes naturally. Everyone makes different decisions and thus lead different lives based on the choices they take. However, we are not always free in the choices we make. There is a variety of different components which shape our ability to make decisions. The choices an individual makes on a daily basis have a lot to do with cultural or religious beliefs. Different cultures have different teachings and different outlooks on what is acceptable and what is forbidden. Parents raise their children according to the way they think and the type of person they would like their child to become. Many parents have certain expectations from their children regarding the decisions they make based on cultural beliefs that the parents or other family members expect their child to follow and abide by. The society one lives in also has a huge impact on the decisions you make. Individuals are expected to act in certain ways in certain societies, and not doing so may cause conflicts. Thus, cultural and societal teachings and expectations impact a large amount of our ability to make choices and often leave us with limited to no choice at all. The circumstances we are in is another factor which often limits the decisions we make, and we do not always have a choice in the circumstances we are put into. An example of this is when a child is born into a very poor family, which hardly has enough food to put on the table. They automatically are limited to making many decisions in their life, such as if they would like to have a proper education. They may not be able to pursue their dreams of having an education due to the circumstances of their family, which may not be able to afford giving their child an education at all. Someone with completely different circumstances, on the other hand, would have a completely different set of choices in their lives, which would allow them to make completely different decisions. Laws and regulations have an immense amount of control on the decisions one can make. Most of the time, there are consequences when the law is broken or bent. In Canada, we have many rules and regulations which every individual is supposed to follow and not question, since it is meant for the well being of everyone. An example of how strong a hold laws can have how strong a hold laws can have on a person's decision making can be seen when an individual is interested in starting their own business in Canada. There are many strict rules and a number of expectations one must complete in order to begin their own business. These regulations and restrictions often have a great impact on the decisions one makes and can affect one's ability to be able to start a business at all if they are not able to live up to these expectations. Since there are usually harsh consequences when a rule or law is broken, people are scared to think or do anything other than what is set for them by the government. All in all, laws and regulations limit the choices we have on a daily basis. To conclude, decision making is shaped by a number of different aspects, such as cultural and societal beliefs, individual circumstances, and laws and regulations. We may not see it or feel it, however, we do not always have a choice, and often our decisions have already been made for us. An individual may be confronted with many problems if they do not take anything into consideration when they make decisions. Thus, wanting to avoid this and the fear of consequences, we do not always have a choice or say in every decision we make throughout life. So, one of the first things that I notice is that the student used a formal tone in their writing. And formal tone can be heard, meaning it's not conversational. It's sort of like at arm's length from the reader, and you see very few contractions. You see, again, a more formal tone, and the sentences are quite long, and that also can give off a more formal tone in the writing. And so that's something that I immediately noticed in this student's writing was really the lengths of their sentences and the tone that they used. So it was definitely not necessarily conversational, it was more formal. And that's one of the things I noticed in this first essay with a score of 7. So I'm going to take this paragraph first, the introduction paragraph. Well, let me zoom out for a minute, right, writers? I apologize. So one of the things I want you to notice is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs. So this is a 5-paragraph essay, and it is almost set up like as if it was what's called a 1-3-1, where you have an introduction, you have 3 body paragraphs, and then a conclusion. And so those are typically called a 1-3-1 essay. And we're going to check to see if their introduction brought up their thesis in the first paragraph, and then checking to see if what they stated was then addressed in each of their body paragraphs. So let's start with the first paragraph, the introduction. It should have the topic. And in this case, it does, because it talks about the decisions that we make, and that decision making how it can be complex. And they look at it from a child's perspective, and then how it changes as we get older. And it talks about how we're all unique because everyone makes different decisions, and we all lead different lives. But then in their last sentence, they do state their position. And that is, however, we are not always free in the choices we make. There is a variety of different components which shape our ability to make decisions. So they talk about this idea of a variety of different components which shape our ability to make decisions. And so they kept this writer was particularly smart by, instead of being too specific, they went broad and they just said a variety of different components. That allowed them to then, in their body paragraphs, describe a variety. Whatever it is that came to their mind, that's what they went with. So they did not specify exactly what they were going to talk about. They went broad and then became more specific in the body paragraphs. For example, in the first sentence, it says the choices an individual, of the second paragraph, the choices an individual makes on a daily basis have a lot to do with cultural or religious beliefs. Now, they could have brought that into this sentence, but they chose not to. And by doing that, right, writers, by being broad and a little bit vague as far as your thesis, it gives you more what I call wiggle room. It gives you more leg room in as far as what you're going to talk about in your body paragraphs, because you may change your mind. And so you have that option when you go broad and you are vague. So they said variety and of different components, and that these components shape our ability, but notice how they were not specific, and that worked to their advantage. Now moving on to the next paragraph. I do want to state, right, writers, just real quick before I move into paragraph 2, look at the lengths of these sentences. So if you notice, and again, if you look at previous videos, you start to understand how the level of your writing increases. You can see the links here. Look at the length of sentence number 1. This is sentence 2, and this is sentence 3. So this is technically a 3-sentence introduction. However, the lengths of the sentences are quite long. Now, I would argue that this student definitely should have used more commas and or periods, because I see a lot of comma splices. And a comma splice is when they're using a comma when they should in fact use a period. However, it did not take away from their writing. All right, moving on to paragraph 2. The choices an individual makes on a daily basis have a lot to do with cultural or religious beliefs. Different cultures have different teachings and different outlooks on what is acceptable and what is forbidden. And then they go into very specific examples of what does it mean to have different cultural and religious beliefs, and how those beliefs impact the society and the expectations. Now, if I had to make one argument, this student did not really give specific examples of what they were talking about, but they went sort of broad and vague, and they just talked about what is acceptable and what is forbidden. But they were not specific and give details of what exactly they were talking about. However, again, looking at what sentence links, that's sentence 1 in paragraph 2. There's another sentence. Here's another sentence. Moving down, and then the last sentence. This student used conjunctive adverbs, or what might be considered transition words within paragraphs, which is excellent. And again, they stuck with the topic. They talked about the cultural religious beliefs, stayed on topic, and connected it back to how that affects decisions made within different cultures. Again, but no specific detailed examples of what they're talking about. Moving on to the next paragraph. In paragraph 3, this writer then focused on the circumstances of our lives is another factor which often limits the decisions we make. Now, in this paragraph, I argue they did a better job by giving specific examples of what they were talking about. They talked about an example of this is when a child is born into a poor family. And then they talked about how that impacts decisions in their lives, including a proper education. Now, I know they had a spelling error here, which would have said like eductation. But again, we knew what they were saying of an education. And then they talked about someone with completely different circumstances would have a completely different set of choices, which would have allowed them to make completely different decisions. I think this is a strong paragraph because they gave an example. However, you could also argue with me, they use the word different quite a bit, not just in this particular paragraph, but in other paragraphs as well. And what happens is when you use a word over and over again, is that the reader then starts to look for the word and stops reading what you're saying. So in this particular sentence right here, they use the word different 3 times. And when they're like this, like on top of each other, the reader notices that even more. So just keep that in mind, right, writers? Try to find synonyms for similar words. Now moving on, they give another example of how laws and regulations control the decisions one can make. And this was also an excellent paragraph because they talked about specifically Canada and the rules and regulations when one is trying to open up a business. And so this was, to me, one of their the best paragraphs. And this best paragraph happened to arrive right before the conclusion. And so I say this, right, writers, because if you have, let's say, 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and you feel as if the first body paragraph that you did was better, then move it around. Use that copy paste and move that body paragraph to right near the conclusion because it's the last thing the reader remembers. And that's typically what guides a score. Again, the student gave examples. An example of how strong a hold laws can have on a person's decision making can be seen when an individual is starting their own business in Canada. Now, they became a little bit vague about regulations and restrictions, and they didn't really talk about what those regulations and restrictions were. But again, at least they offered an example of, again, starting a business. And then they talked about, harsh consequences that people face when laws are broken. And again, just sort of a good way to kind of end that body paragraph. And so that was what they decided to focus on this variety of components. And then they ended it with some excellent, again, that transition word to conclude. And then they bring back this idea of now they really tied in their thesis because it says to conclude, decision making is shaped by a number of different aspects, such as cultural and societal beliefs, individual circumstances, and laws and regulations. So in this case, this is really their thesis. Now, what would have been great is if they had taken this and before they submitted their essay, copied and pasted it up in the introduction. And so they could have used that bit right here, right in this section. We are not always free in the choices we make. There's a variety of different components which shape our ability to make our decisions. And then they could have said, make our decisions. Those decisions include cultural, societal beliefs, individual circumstances, and laws and regulations. And then that would have given them, again, that thesis in their introduction. Then they close with how we may or may not see it or feel it, and how, these decisions, these choices that we have, they argue have already been made for us. And so, again, sort of they're bringing in their own personal opinion. And they reiterate that point by saying we do not always have a choice or say in every decision we make throughout life. And so, again, notice how this is the exact same thing, pretty much the same thing they said right here. They just repeated it. And that is excellent repetition as far as arguing your point. And they're spread far enough away from each other where it's more of an emphasis rather than an empty repetition. Now I want to go back and look at their transitions between paragraphs. So I think we'll go ahead and take it from the top, right, writers. So let's look at their transition between the first paragraph and the second. And that's their introduction and their first body paragraph. So they argue, however, we are not always free in the choices we make. There's a variety of different components which shape our ability to make decisions. And then they go into the choices an individual makes on a daily basis have a lot to do with cultural religious beliefs. So no doubt they talk about choices here and transition here. I say this is an okay transition between paragraphs, not too bad between these. Again, you could argue if they had taken that thesis and placed it up here, it would have allowed for a much smoother transition. Now let's move on to the next paragraph transition. So from here to here, we're going to look at and see how they did. Thus, cultural and societal teachings and expectations impact a large amount of our ability to make choices and often leave us with limited to no choice at all. The circumstances we are in is another factor which often limits the decisions we make. I argue that this is a better transition between paragraphs because they discuss limitations and then bring up this idea of limitations in the next paragraph. I think this is a much smoother transition between paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. Now let's look at between paragraph 3 and 4. Someone with completely different circumstances, on the other hand, would have a completely different set of choices in their lives, which would allow them to make completely different decisions. Laws and regulations have an immense amount of control on the decisions one can make. Not so smooth on the transition on this one. I argue that this is very similar to the difference between the first paragraph and the second paragraph. However, again, they're on topic, and it's not a big hiccup between paragraphs on this one. So again, how do you make it smoother? Well, they could have said, again, how to ultimately, right, writers, what I tell students is, look, what you have to do is you actually have to go ahead and write your next paragraph, and then you have to come back to this part here, and then write a sentence after different decisions that will segue into this one. And so some students are able to do it as they're writing, but I find that most students have to just go back and put in that fluid transition back into the last sentence of the paragraph before they move into the next paragraph. And they could have done this by saying something like, someone with completely different circumstances, on the other hand, would have a completely different set of choices in their lives, which would allow them to make completely different decisions. And then I might say something like, and even the government has a say in the decisions we can make. Boom. Next paragraph. Laws and regulations have an immense amount of control on the decisions one can make. And so, really, again, those kinds of sentences need to be added in after the next paragraph has already been built. And I argue, students, it's one of the most challenging concepts for writers to work with is again transitioning between two paragraphs. Moving on, let's take a look at again from here to here. And they did well by saying, all in all, laws and regulations limit the choices we have on a daily basis. They sort of wrapped it up and then gave us a concluding, basically a transition word that demonstrates, hey, I'm going to conclude this paragraph. To conclude, decision making, and maybe they should have said decision making or choice making choices is shaped, because then that would make this transition between these two sentences a little bit smoother. But again, I liked how they brought in their thesis, which is pretty much like their main idea, letting us know what their body paragraphs were going to be about. Again, I argue they should have placed this up at the top as well, especially if you have time remaining to do that. Do it. It will help strengthen your writing. But again, the student did an awesome job, and they did an excellent job making sure that their last two paragraphs, really just hit that home run for the reader to, again, I argue, strengthen their score. I cannot emphasize enough how the last two paragraphs of your writing will really dictate the two scores, whether you get one score or whether you get another score. Those last two paragraphs are essential to your writing. Please do not just think that they're throwaway paragraphs. On the contrary. All right, writers, here's sample essay number 2, score of 7. Let's go ahead and begin our reading. Everyone must start somewhere. Despite living in one of the most upwardly mobile countries in history, Americans do not have equality of origin. For example, some are born into wealth and prosperity with the whole world seemingly laid before them. They are easily able to chart a course for their life And having the resources at hand, they can pursue that course and rise to even greater wealth and prosperity. Others are born into poverty. Their choices are more narrow and are mainly focused on surviving day to day. This second group, however, does not have to remain in the circumstances of their beginnings forever. By recognizing their situation and making the best of the choices they can make, and tenaciously pursuing goals and opportunities as they come up, they can expand their options and take responsibility for their future. The beginning of overcoming a poor beginning is recognizing your position. In my own case, being the son of an abusive father, I was raised in poverty by my single mother. There was always a sense of hopelessness around. Not knowing it, this feeling defined my childhood and teenage years. As far as I knew, my life was heading nowhere. At 15, however, I recognized that I had a choice to make in the outcome of my life. I began to ask for help from some of my teachers, and I began to look for chances, pursue my interests by taking classes in computers and technology. It wasn't much, but by steadily making decisions that expanded my options, little by little, I began to escape the fog of hopelessness. At 16, I realized that I would need to make a clean break from my past if I was to have any chance at a brighter future. I was in my second year of high school, and my mother was going through her third divorce with an alcoholic and abusive husband. He got arrested and sent to jail for drunk driving, and she decided that she could have a better life if she uprooted my sister and I by moving to Florida with her sister. I knew this would be the path to ruin for me. I decided to take a chance on myself and tell my mother that I was not going with her. I spoke with my guidance counselor and asked for her help in telling my mother what I was going to do. Mrs. Lewis set the appointment, called an aunt of mine who lived in the area, and set it up so I could stay with her family until I finished high school. On the day of the meeting, she encouraged me to speak my heart about my decision and stood by me when I laid things out for my mom. In the end, my mother agreed to allow me to stay with my aunt while she moved away. The 2.5 years of high school that followed were very trying. However, by standing up for myself and choosing to break from my past, I chose to pursue a path that ultimately led to my having a happy marriage with a wife I love and 3 amazing children. I also have a career in a field I can be successful in along as I want. In summary, by recognizing my position, making the best of the decisions I had, and with tenacity taking risks on myself, I broke away from a hopeless future. I started with nothing, but today my horizons are broad and my future is bright. Very different from the first essay. So this is an essay, writers, that comes from the heart. This is a personal essay with an argumentative point of view. And it's one of those essays where it's hard to argue with someone who has, as an example, a personal story and weaves in that personal story into their writing. And I'm happy with that Accuplacer Writeplacer sort of provides these very different essays so that you can get a sense of, some essays seem to be more conversational and personal, while some tend to be more formal and distant, yet you can still have a similar score. And this is one of those examples where you can see how being formal and distant can get you a 7, but also being personal and conversational and vulnerable and transparent with your own life can also get you a score of a 7. So let's take a look at what this writer did very well within their personal story and using that story to their advantage. So in their introduction paragraph, I really appreciate how the first sentence is just a very simple sentence, literally, short. There's some depth to it. Everyone must start somewhere. There's no arguing that. We all have to start somewhere. So I really like that first, very simple short sentence, which can somewhat feel abrupt, but it makes you interested in learning about where this writer is going to go. And then they go into explaining what they mean, arguing that, again, that even though we live in a very mobile, upwardly mobile country, that is dependent upon, wealth, and how poverty can impact that. And then how that can, again, limit one's choices, and what those choices, examples of what those choices are. Again, their choices are narrow, surviving day to day. So they sort of give this dichotomy of the wealth and prosperity versus someone into poverty. But here's what's unique. So this writer then uses that poor beginning, the others are born into poverty, and then focuses on that in the introduction by saying this second group does not have to remain in the circumstances of their beginnings forever. And this is what's going to lead us into the body paragraphs, because this writer comes from that background and then makes the argument, argues that, again, you've got to take responsibility for your own future and that you can do that. And so this is, again, argumentative and very convincing. And then they take that and use that to then discuss their own beginnings in poverty and being the son of an abusive father. And they give very specific examples. And there's no, they talked about, again, how they discuss their life with their teachers, being interested in computers and technology. Notice how that's very specific, and that, they bring up this idea, this sense of hopelessness, and then end that paragraph by talking about, I began to escape the fog of hopelessness. And that's really strong, compelling, personal writing. And that is definitely apparent in this first body paragraph, again, with very specific personal examples. The single mother, and again, if you have any background with that in your own upbringing, this is a pretty compelling paragraph, right, writers? All right, and notice how they're sort of at 15, and then they jump to 16. And so in this next body paragraph, they talk about, escaping this fog of hopelessness and realizing that they would need to, again, escape their past, and then again go into details, personal details of their life about, having to make a very important choice. And that choice was not moving with his mother to Florida, to move in with, because he says, and that's a really strong sentence. I knew this would be the path to ruin for me. What a compelling sentence. And again, speaking to the guidance counselor, and then giving very specific examples from family members and the decisions, again, that specificity, getting, he got arrested, sent to jail for drunk driving. Again, it's so much easier to give very specific and personal examples when you're talking about your own life. So do not discount your own personal experiences, right, writers, because those experiences are very useful when it comes to essay writing. And if the essay writers allow you to use your personal experiences, then by all means do so. Do it to your advantage. Now moving into the next paragraph. Then they again followed it up by, sort of going in a chronological order. and then talking about the 2.5 years that followed him were trying. And, he chose to pursue a path that ultimately led to him having a happy marriage, a wife, 3 children, and in a career in a field I can be successful in as long as I want. There's a couple grammatical errors, but again, it does not take away from the writing. I would argue this paragraph was a little bit short, but they might have been running out of time, or they might have started to notice that they were limited on the amount of words that they had, and so they had to make it a shorter one. Again, it would have been nice to bring in maybe that college piece right here. And, I assume that he went into a career of technology, but again, they at least sort of kept on with what followed after really his sophomore year and wrapped up his junior and senior year, and how that decision of not going to Florida really helped him to begin to build the life that he wanted for himself. He gave a very short conclusion in summary, but he gave a transition word, again, that in summary, and then just sort of wrapping up by taking being willing to take risks, being able to break himself away from his mother and the decisions that she was making, and just saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go my own way. He started with nothing, but realizes again today how his horizons are broad and his future is bright. My future is bright. So, a short conclusion. This is an example of a short conclusion, but it's compelling and it gives us closure to this particular student's life. It becomes challenging as a person to critique work when it's such a personal story. And again, those very specific examples where he stayed on topic and gave a very compelling argument in that, we do have choices in life, and those choices really depend upon us taking responsibility for our own future. Again, this student had excellent sentence fluency, meaning they had different lengths of sentences, which I think created even more just a more fluid writing style, and again, just strengthened their writing in general. We started off with that very simple first sentence, and then again, notice, writers, the lengths of these sentences, that they change, that they're not all the same length. He'll go with like a long sentence, a medium written sentence, medium length, and then back to a short sentence, then to a little bit longer and a little bit longer. And then even this one is the longest one he has, is the last sentences in his introduction. Yes, there are some comma splices. He could have used some periods, but again, it creates variety in the reading. Then, so looking at this last sentence, we see an excellent transition because it talks about this second group, again, of poverty, and they can expand their options and take responsibility for their future. The beginning of overcoming a poor beginning is recognizing your position. And then he goes into, in my own case. So just that self-awareness that comes into that is really where he then took charge of his own life. So becoming self-aware, and that transition between these two paragraphs is excellent because again, he goes from the broad to the specific of himself and his own poor beginnings. And you could argue, well, if he had not had this sentence at all, listen to this one right here. So listen to this going into this sentence. So let's pretend he had not written this sentence, and instead he stopped here. This second group, however, does not have to remain in the circumstances of their beginnings forever. The beginning of overcoming a poor beginning is recognizing your position. In my own case, notice, writers, how that would have actually been even better. And then what he could have done is maybe used this part that I highlighted here in blue and move that down into that really, really short baby paragraph that he wrote where he was married and had 3 children. That would have given more room for that paragraph. So again, good transition, but sometimes, less is more. And this would have been this from this sentence to this one would have also been a great transition. So just keep that in mind, right, writers? So he talks about little by little, I began to escape the fog of hopelessness. And then he goes into the next paragraph. At 16, I realized that I would need to make a clean break from my past. So he transitions in explaining how he escapes this fog of hopelessness, because he says, if I was to have any chance at a brighter future. Obviously, bright is not the same as living a life of fog. And so that is a pretty good transition between this as well. I argued before, this idea of chronological order. So going in order of his life and staying in order. Then we go into, in the end, my mother agreed to allow me to stay with my aunt while she moved away. The 2.5 years of high school that followed were very trying. And again, you could argue, well, he should have moved this and had this just here, but he chose not to because he said in the end. And so he was then transitioning into another topic. While the transition is fine, this is, again, my only issue ultimately is with this paragraph, the length of it, whether he should have maybe put this paragraph with the one above it, maybe deleting it all together. Maybe you didn't really need that. Just end it with in summary, or maybe had this paragraph into the concluding paragraph. I think maybe that would have also been a good choice. But ultimately, again, the story was so compelling that it just stayed with you, even though the endings were, the last 2 paragraphs were a bit short and abrupt. I argue the storytelling really just swept the reader into this writer's world. And I think that ultimately carried the day for this particular writer. Now, what I do like about this, right, writers, is that he does, again, bring up this idea of hopeless future to the future being bright. And that is a running theme within this essay. So, I broke away from a hopeless future, bright future, and notice how, again, he brought that up, this idea of hopelessness, and weaved it in through the entire essay. And again, I think that also is important, taking responsibility, and again, if it would have been great bringing up this, again, this hopeless future or a bright future, but hopelessness, but he still said making the best choices. And again, tenaciously pursuing goals and opportunities as they come up. And then he brought up this, hopelessness and bright future in his other paragraphs. Looking at an essay comparison between these 2 sevens, you can begin to see, again, how sentence fluency, having different lengths of sentences, strengthen your writing, having specific paragraph breaks, but also how you can stay formal and still have a high score by giving details and examples, but you can also be very personal. Well, writers, I hope this journey, again, helps you to think about how to approach your essay, your Accuplacer Writeplacer essay, and ensures your success in scoring what you need to score in order to begin at the ENC 1101 level. Thank you so much, writers. Take care. Have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, and see you soon with the next video. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.